Good day, everyone. Welcome to our lesson in Practical Research 2. For today's discussion, we are going to learn about data interpretation and presentation. So, after collecting and analyzing data, our work as researchers does not simply end with computing the results. So, basically, we still need to answer an important question, which is on how are we going to present and explain the results of our research or result of the data gathering procedure that we've done. So imagine you have already conducted your survey, your experiment, your research study. Now you have a lot of numbers and information, right? So the next question is, how will you make those results understandable to your readers, to your panels, no, or to the future researchers who will be using your research as their basis as well, as in case your paper will get published. So this is where data presentation and interpretation become an important part of our study. So when we say data presentation, it allows us to organize and display our findings clearly, while data interpretation allows us to explain what those findings actually mean. So in today's lesson, we will learn how to present and interpret research data using different forms. So now let us think about the research process. So we begin with the research problem, then we collect data, and after collecting data, we analyze the data using appropriate statistical tools or procedures, right? But after data analysis, what comes next? So the answer is, just like what I mentioned a while back, is the data interpretation and presentation. So we need to transform our analyzed data into a form that our readers can easily understand. For example, instead of presenting a long list of numbers, we may organize them into a table. Or instead of explaining a trend using several paragraphs, we may use a line graph. Instead of simply listing the proportion of respondents belonging to different categories, we may use a pie or pie graph. Therefore, a good data presentation makes your research findings clearer, more organized, and easier to understand. So before we delve deeper in our discussion, let us have a quick activity. So I need you to look carefully at the picture on the screen, no, on the picture that I will be presenting. So I need you to guess and yeah, guess what it represents. Okay, so I need you to take few seconds and observe onto it, and then I need you to write your answer on the comment section so that I could go ahead and do record, know whether you participated in this video lesson or not. So you may ask yourself, no, what information does this picture is trying to communicate? Is it showing a comparison, showing a trend, showing parts of a whole, or it's just simply showing a relationship between variables? So it is really important for us to know or determine um, the type of information being presented visually, because that would really help us to look for appropriate techniques in displaying data. So the first picture is this. Okay, what do we call this first picture? Okay, the second picture is this one. What do we call this picture? Picture number two. Number three, what do we call this picture number three? And last one is this picture number four. As we continue, allow me to share the learning objectives of this lesson. So at the end of this lesson, you should be able to accomplish three things. First, to determine appropriate presentation of data based on your research problem. Second, present and interpret data in textual, tabular, and graphical forms. And lastly, apply the appropriate presentation and interpretation of data in the research study. So there are three common techniques used to display data. So we have the hmm, We have the tabular method, graphical method, and textual method. So in today's discussion, we are going to discuss each one. So let us begin with the textual presentation of data. So as its definition explains, no, it uses words, statements, or paragraph with numerals, numbers, or measurement to describe data. So textual presentation again uses words and statements and numbers, no, in order for this to describe a certain data. So simply in other words, instead of putting the data in a table or graph, we explain the results using sentences. For example, suppose your research asks about the number of students who prefer different research topics. So instead of immediately creating a graph, you could write, among the respondents, 60 students preferred environmental topics, while 40 students preferred technology-related topics. So you notice what we did? We used words and numbers to communicate the result. So that is textual presentation. So it is particularly useful when we only have a small amount of information to communicate or when we want to highlight a particular finding. Okay, one of the important things that we need to remember in textual presentation is that we should just focus on the most important findings. So, example, we conducted a survey with 10 different indicators. Do not necessarily, you do not need to necessarily um, describe every single value in a long paragraph. So you just need to focus on the important patterns that you observed. Just like with this example that we have here, there are 42,000 36 barangays in the Philippines. The largest barangay in terms of population size is Barangay 176 in Caloocan City with 247,000 persons. It is followed by Commonwealth in Quezon City with 198,285 persons and Batasan Hills in Quezon City with 161,409. 12 other barangays posted a population size of more than 100,000 persons. So here, the population size of 42,036 barangays in the Philippines were not mentioned. It is because we are just simply looking for the population, which is the largest population only. So definitely in this example, we just mentioned the top three barangays that have largest population in terms of numbers. So just like we mentioned a while back, we just need to focus on the important patterns, on the important, most important findings, as we mentioned. So again, in textual presentation, we can mention the highest result, the lowest result, notable differences, or other findings that directly answer your research question. Again, one more thing that you need to remember is that we aren't just reporting numbers. We need to explain what the numbers tell us. Okay, so again, the distinction between reporting and interpreting data is very important. Okay, now let us move on to the second technique, which is the tabular presentation. So tables allow us to present information in an organized manner. So a table can make a large amount of information easier to read because the data are arranged systematically in rows and columns, right? So this lesson emphasizes that tables present data clearly in an organized way. So, table is one of the common tool that we use as we present data in our research, right? In every findings, in presenting the number of population, in showing the processes, and having the um, information or sorry, in showing the information or data that we've gathered. So for researchers, tables are especially useful when we need to present several categories, variables, frequencies, percentage, or statistical results at the same time. So a good research table should contain several important parts. So that includes um, the table and the title, the caption and the subhead, the body of the table, and then of course, it is important for us as well to include the source, no, if it is applicable. So let us look at these parts one by one. Yeah. Now, notice that table does not necessarily stand alone. Hmm. We can present a table and then provide a textual analysis underneath or after it to make it holistic, to make it more informational. So this is actually very important in research writing. Table gives us, no, the readers, your panels, no, the numerical information. So the paragraph, on the other hand, explains the meaning of that information. For example, after presenting a table, we might say the results show that the respondents obtained the highest mean in indicator 1, while indicator 4 obtained the lowest mean. Then we continue with the suggestions, no? So, if you're going to notice the difference with the one that I mentioned, no? So the first one sentence reports the data, and then the second one begins to interpret the data. So therefore, when you write your research findings, remember that the combination of table plus textual analysis would be giving you a clearer presentation and interpretation, of course, of your data. So this is an example of tabular presentation. So table and number, we have the title, we have the caption subhead, we have the columns, we have the rows on it, we have the text to supply or to be to complement rather the table presentation. Okay. So as we move further, so yeah, we also have the body here. Ito yun siya. Okay. Now let us proceed to our third technique, which is the graphical presentation of data. So a graph or chart presents data visually using symbols such as lines, dots, bars, or slices. Um, Graphs are useful because, of course, our eyes can often recognize patterns more quickly in visual presentation than in a long list of numbers. However, we should remember that not every graph is appropriate for every type of data. So the graph we choose should depend on the nature of the data and the research problem. So our this lesson introduces several types of graphs, which are um, as follows. So we have the line graph, the double line graph, the bar graph, and the pie chart. Okay, so let us talk about first the line graph. So a line graph is a graphical presentation of data that uses a continuous change or trend. So when we are trying to interpret rather a line graph, we pay attention to the direction of the line. So if the line moves upwards, the values are increasing. If the line moves downward, the values are decreasing. If the line remains flat, the values are stable. So we should also identify significant points. So we need to ask ourselves or ask, when did the highest value occur? When did the lowest value occur? Was there a sudden increase? Was there a sudden decrease? So those observations can become part of your interpretation. But remember, we should avoid making conclusions that the graph itself cannot support. So we need to describe what the data actually shows. So take a look on this example. So just like what we mentioned a while back, we need to know the details, no, the when and the what na, of the data that we have. Okay, so let's continue with the double line graph. A double line graph uses two lines connecting points to show continuous change in the data over time. The advantage of the double line graph, of course, is it allows us to compare two sets of data across the same sequence or period. For example, we are comparing the performance of Group A and Group B across several assessments. We can use one line for Group A and then another line for Group B. So this allows us to observe not only the trend of each group, but also the differences between them. When we are interpreting a double line graph, we should ask what happened to the first group, what happened to the second group, and which group consistently had higher values, and were there points where the two groups became closer or farther apart. So we have here an example of a double line graph. All right. So after that, we have the bar graph. Okay, so now let us apply what we have learned to an actual research situation. So our presentation should begin with the statement of the problem or SOP. Why? Because our research questions determine what information we need to present and interpret. For example, the presentation in this discussion provides an SOP involving respondents' awareness regarding the provisions of a proposed law. So when answering that SOP, we need to identify what variable are we measuring, what data were collected, what statistical result answers the question, and what presentation best communicates that result. So the first example, this one, asks, what is the level of awareness of the respondents regarding the provisions of the proposed law? So notice the phrase level of awareness. So this tells us that the researcher are measuring the respondents' awareness. So when interpreting the result, we should identify the appropriate statistical summary and explain the obtained result. Um, and the obtained result indicates about the respondent's level of awareness. So as you look at the example on this slide, you need to pay attention to the presented result. So again, ask yourself, what is the overall level? Which indicator obtained the highest result? Which obtained the lowest result? What does the result tells us about the respondents? So when we present our own study, our interpretation should directly answer the SOP rather than discussing information that is unrelated to the research question. So I mean, in other words, we need to be direct in interpreting the data that we have gathered, and at the same time, we need to make it sure that that will answer the research question or research problem that we have. Okay, so the next example asks, what are the forms of perceptions of the respondents about the provisions of the proposed law? Here, the researcher is interested in the respondents' perceptions. Again, we should examine the data and determine what presentation clearly communicates the findings. So when interpreting this type of result, we should identify the dominant or notable patterns in the responses. So we should not simply copy the numbers from the table or graph. Instead, we should explain what those numbers tell us about the respondents' perceptions. Another example is asking about the reasons of the respondents for participating or not participating in the proposed law. So if you're going to take a look on the nature of the research question, it affects the way we present our data. If respondents provide different reasons, we may organize those reasons into categories and show their frequencies or percentages. Then, our interpretation should identify which reasons were most common and which were less common. For example, our interpretation might focus on the most frequently reported reason and the least frequently reported reason, and meaningful differences among the categories. Then, the important thing is to connect the findings to the specific SOE. Okay, our for final example is that it has a question. What is the correlation between the student's level of awareness and degree of agreement towards their participation in the proposed bill? So this question is different from the earlier ones. Why? Because this question is asking about a relationship between two variables. So what are the variables that we have here? So first, we have the level of awareness, students' level of awareness, and then we have the degree of agreement towards participation. Because the research question asks about correlation, the researchers need to use an appropriate correlational analysis. So the results should be then presented and interpreted in relation to the question, just like what we keep on repeating. Okay. When interpreting the correlation, we should consider both the direction and the strength of the relationship, of course, as well as the appropriate statistical evidence. But remember, correlation does not automatically establish causation or a cause and effect relationship. If two variables are related, we cannot immediately conclude that one variable caused the other. So at this point, we need to remember that one very important rule: do not interpret data without going back to your research question. So the bottom line is your research problem is your guide. Okay. For every table or graph that you are going to have for your interpretation and presentation, you need to ask, what research question does this answer? And also, what does the result tell us? Is that what I mean? What we mentioned, interpretation, presentation is different from interpretation. In interpretation, um, you are definitely showing the findings of the study. So finally, why is this finding important to our study? You need to think of that as well. If you can answer those three questions, you are already on the right path toward an effective data interpretation. So do you have any questions or clarifications? If you do have, feel free to type your questions in our comment section so that we could address that question on our mind. So that's it, and